Good morning. Good morning. I'm Bob Hodap, and I have the privilege today to introduce Doug and Lynn Fuchs. Before I begin, let me mention that there are evaluation sheets in the back, and there are CME credits. If you want CME credits, you need to do the evaluations and sign in, okay? I think that's the main thing I need to say about that. I should also mention that, and it's been flashing here, that neither Doug nor Lynn nor I have any financial ties to anything, which is probably not so bad these days. Today it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Doug and Lynn Fuchs. Let me tell you very briefly about them. They both received their bachelor's from Johns Hopkins, master's in education from Penn, and then their Ph.D.s from University of Minnesota. They were in for a few years in the Boston area at Clark University, and then they came to Vanderbilt in 1985. And they are currently the co-holders of the Nicholas Hobbs Chair in Special Ed and Human Development. And as many of you know, Nicholas Hobbs was the founder of the Kennedy Center that is co-sponsoring this event. They are, it's hard to overview their vitas and bio sketches because there's so many things. They're the holders of awards from the major organizations in special education, including the Council for Exceptional Children, AERA, the American Education Research Association. They've received numerous sort of best articles, Mayor's Award, Vanderbilt, Joe B. Wyatt Outstanding Professor, Earl Sutherland Prize. They're the co-directors of the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center Reading Clinic. They have many publications in the hundreds. They're the grant awardees from major grants from the IES and from NICHD, two of the main funders in education. Their areas also span several areas: peer-assisted learning, learning disabilities, and particularly identification and classification of children. And I think what they're going to talk about today, they are, I would say, the main proponents probably in the country on this thing called responsiveness to intervention, which is I'll let you do it, but a major approach which I think is really, in many ways, on the edge of science, policy, and practice. And on a personal level, they're both really good colleagues, and I'm happy to have the honor of being with them. Let me introduce them both. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out bright and early. I've had a half a cup of coffee, so I'll be at least 50% coherent. Lynn and I are very happy to speak with you this morning about responsiveness to intervention because we've done a lot of work in this area over a very long period of time, well before it was called RTI. We've worked on areas of assessment and instruction that 15, 20 years ago that now, and so have many other people, and now some of these components are being brought into this RTI framework that Lynn and I are going to talk with you a little bit about. Excited too because RTI, I think, comes at a propitious time for Middle Tennessee and the Metro Nashville schools. I think that RTI, from a policy and practice perspective, offers a way to think about service delivery, educational services, in a different way, and for a number of reasons, perhaps a better way than the way that many people have conventionally thought about general education and special education services, especially for at-risk children and children with special needs. So Lynn and I have this tough job here, and we have to talk with you about research and practice in 50 minutes. And so we're going to necessarily have to be very selective in what we say and brief. Hopefully there will be time for some questions at the end. I want to acknowledge up front that the work that Lynn and I are going to talk with you about, the research that we're going to talk with you about, has been conducted with our close colleague Don Compton and Joan Bryant, and a number of graduate students who did a wonderful job. Okay, so responsiveness to intervention meaningfully integrates assessment and instruction. A lot is said about, the importance of linking assessment, getting information on children, and instruction. A lot is said about it, but infrequently do we see in practice this meaningful integration. RTI attempts to do that, both to reduce the number of children who are at risk in a school district or a school building, and to more validly identify kids who need special education. RTI is probably the signature characteristic of RTI. And by the way, in this talk, what we're trying to do is, some of you no doubt know a lot about RTI, and some of you know very little about RTI. We're aiming toward a middle that we only vaguely understand here. So some of this will be foundational for you, and you've heard it before for some of you, and for some of you not. So that's, the compromise that all speakers have to make. So the basic feature of RTI is that it is layered. The instruction is layered. Or tiered, or multi-leveled. So there's, and there are also a number of models of RTI. So there is not one model. There are multiple models. Lynn and I will be talking about one. And the one we're talking about has 3 levels. Others talk about 4 levels and 5 levels and so forth. And so we're talking today about 3. And in our framework, there's primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. In primary prevention, which takes place in the regular classroom, all children receive, hopefully, an evidence-based core curriculum. And they are tested, all children are tested in the beginning of the year on a good, valid screening measure. Children who do not meet a valid cut point, do not score high enough, are deemed worthy of, are targeted for progress monitoring. So their progress is monitored. Hopefully in a class of 25 or 30 kids, we're talking about no more than 3 to 5 or 6 children. If we're talking about 26 of 30 children, then we're not talking, then we don't focus on RTI. We don't focus on the multiple levels of RTI. We need to do something important to that classroom, to helping the teacher become more effective and so forth. But if we're talking about a relatively small group of 5 out of 25 or 30 kids, these children then are monitored for 6 or so weeks to determine kids who respond or don't respond to the classroom instruction. And the idea is to see which children are going to be, quote unquote, non-responsive, which children we designate as non-responsive, and which children who over a 5 or 6 or 7 week period become responsive. The children who remain unresponsive, they do poorly on the screen, and they do poorly during progress monitoring over the subsequent 5 to 8 weeks, are then targeted for secondary prevention. And secondary prevention is deliberately a more intensive form of instruction. Typically, an instructor uses what we call a standard treatment protocol. This is a validated protocol for at-risk children in a specific academic domain. The instructor meets with small groups of homogeneously grouped children. The children get more instruction for a greater duration of time. Perhaps the expertise of the instructor lends to the intensity of this. In any case, from primary to secondary prevention must be more intensive. And this is one of the things Lynn and I, really like about RTI, because RTI, in this respect and others, represents an effort to make general education more strong, more accommodating of a greater diversity of kids. Traditionally, general education is the regular classroom. Now we're talking about primary prevention and secondary prevention. A stronger, more ambitious effort to address the needs of at-risk children. During secondary prevention, children their progress continues to be monitored. And children who do well in secondary prevention return to primary prevention. Children who do not do well, who continue to be non-responsive, even to this more intensive instruction, are then targeted for tertiary prevention. Tertiary prevention is, for Lynn and me and for others, special education, but not special education business as usual, a different kind of special education, which we can only talk very briefly about here because of time. But the special education that Lynn and I have in mind goes back, in a sense, 20 or 30 years, when when special education in many more places across the country was understood to be child-focused, individualized, data-based, and recursive, meaning that special educators were strong instructors, prepared well by colleges and universities to work with children and with data to develop over time the instructional program that worked best for each child. Okay, so primary, secondary, tertiary prevention are the levels that make up the structure of RTI. RTI is borrowed from multi-level prevention system, concepts of multi-level prevention. If you think of, many of you, all of you I hope, have primary care physicians, and one of the things that person does is check your blood pressure. So you're screened for high blood pressure. If on a particular day you have high blood pressure, the doctor notes that and says, what? We need to test you again. You need to come back. We need to verify. And so you come back 4 or 5 weeks later, and you still have high blood pressure, and so you are then given a non-invasive drug, a diuretic perhaps, and diuretics work for many, many people to reduce blood pressure, end of story. But there's a small number of people who need something more. They need a more invasive procedure, like beta blockers or something of that sort. And sometimes you've got to go back when you're on a more invasive drug. Your doctor has to work with you to find the right dosage. Well, all of this is, you can see the primary, secondary, tertiary effort here in medicine. It's a decent analogy, I think, for RTI. Importantly, what we're trying to prevent in this medical analogy is what? What is your doctor trying to prevent you from having? A stroke, heart attack. Similarly, RTI and the multiple levels of RTI is meant to prevent school dropout, unemployment, incarceration, poor health, all of these extremely important after-school outcomes. There are people across the country who incorrectly understand RTI to mean that it's all about preventing special education. That's not the issue. That's not what we keep our eye fixed on. Special education as a tier or as a level in RTI must work with general education. General education must become responsible, must step up and take ownership of the first 2 levels of prevention. Special ed, likewise, must take responsibility for that third, and there must be strong cooperation between the two. RTI comes from the 2004 reauthorization of IDEA, which encourages educators to use RTI in addition to or instead of the traditional means of identifying children with learning disabilities. Really, RTI technically comes out of an effort on the part of the federal government to give practitioners a stronger, more meaningful way of identifying and working with children with learning disabilities. As you know, learning disabilities represents the the largest proportion of children with disabilities among all kids with disabilities in the country. And the primary concern among the federales and what guided their efforts with respect to the 2004 reauthorization was the feeling that conventional methods of LD identification, that is, using IQ achievement discrepancy, is fraught with all kinds of technical measurement issues and also inadvertently requiring children to fail many, many times before their IQ and achievement discrepancy reached a sufficient level to warrant identification or classification as LD. The idea here is that RTI permits quicker intervention. As soon as children in the regular classroom are showing an unsatisfactory slope or rate of progress, the idea is to provide intervention very, very quickly and not wait, sometimes for years, for the IQ and achievement to separate sufficiently to be classified. So an important part of RTI focuses on at-risk children, non-disabled, non-identified, at-risk kids, providing hopefully strong evidence-based instruction to ward off subsequent identification. So the first purpose of RTI is to reorient service delivery to provide early intervention. The second, to provide an alternative and hopefully more valid method of LD identification. More valid because if RTI is done correctly, children are receiving generally effective instruction. That is, instruction that will work for most children. If the child participates in that instruction and still performs poorly, we have greater confidence that the poor performance is more due to the child and not to the fact that the teacher or teachers are not delivering appropriate instruction, sufficiently effective instruction. See? All right, so RTI, what we are doing here, Lynn, Don, and I, and others, and what we're trying to do, and what our colleagues across the country are doing, are addressing some very interesting technical measurement and more conceptual issues in our research. And much of it has, I think, important impact for practice. So we're interested in precursors to LD and how to screen LD. We're interested in early intervention to decrease so-called instructional casualties, children who are subjected to ineffective instruction. And by doing that, we decrease false positives. That is, we decrease the number of children who look like they're LD or otherwise special needs, but really are not. And how to quantify response. What does it mean to be responsive or unresponsive to intervention? If you think hard about it, there are lots of different ways to think about that and to define it and to operationalize it. Characteristics of responders and non-responders. What are essential differences between first grade children who respond to early reading instruction and those who do not? And then methods of intensifying instruction in secondary and tertiary prevention to prevent or to mitigate the effects of disability like LD. So what I want to do, so in this presentation, I'm going to talk briefly about early intervention for at-risk students to decrease the numbers of so-called false positives. And Lynn is then going to talk about precursors to and screening for learning disabilities. And so I'm going to have to go through this pretty quickly. But this is research that we conducted several years ago in the Metro Nashville Public Schools. We've had wonderful, over the years, Lynn and I have had 20-plus years of terrific partnership with the Metro schools. I know that there's some Metro school folk here, and we really regard you guys as our partners in many, many ways. And so this was done with, this research was conducted with Don Compton, Lynn, Joan Bryant, and Nikki Davis. The study involved both Williamson County and Metro Nashville schools. As you see, a total of 16 elementary school, 8 Title I, 8 not. 42 first grade teachers across these two districts were randomly assigned within schools to reduce possible school effects. to a PALS, that's peer-assisted learning strategies, or no PALS conditions. For this presentation, I'm ignoring that distinction, so we've got 42 classrooms, and we're talking about instruction in, right now we're talking about, and what I will be talking about is instruction in Tier 2. So the 42 classrooms, all students in these 42 classrooms were screened on various measures. You see those measures, including student judgment. The 6 lowest students per class, the 6 lowest kids per 42 classrooms, were rank ordered from, now these are the lowest 6, but they were rank ordered from high to low. Those 6 were then, that rank ordering was divided in half, and in the top half, the top 3 were randomly assigned to one group, and let's see. Okay, right. So the bottom 6 were split in half, so we have a top 3 and a bottom 3, and the top 3 were randomly assigned to 3 groups, and the bottom 3 were randomly assigned to 3 groups. The 3 groups were fall tutoring, spring tutoring, maybe, and controls. The fall tutoring group got tutoring, secondary prevention, right away, okay, on the basis of them falling into the bottom 6 kids in their class. The spring tutoring maybe kids and the control kids were identified after fall semester. They had to not only initially fall in the bottom 6, but then they had to prove by poor performance that they were indeed doing badly throughout the fall semester. And so and in this presentation, what I want to do is I want to focus on the spring tutored children, the children who performed poorly throughout the fall semester, and the control children who also performed poorly during the fall semester. We collected data. We monitored our children's performance 9 times in the fall, 9 times in the spring. The children who we deemed unresponsive in January, both in the spring tutored group and the control group, had to do badly, had to show what we call a dual discrepancy. They had to do poorly both in their level of performance and their rate of growth. So we had 9 data points in the fall, and drawing lines of best fit through those data, we could determine which children were growing appropriately for their age, and which ones were not. So dual discrepancy. Those were the kids that we were interested in finding in January, and we found 40 of 84 spring tutored maybe children, and 24 of 84 of control children who met our dual discrepancy criterion. Okay, you with me? So we end up with following, as we go forward, we're talking about 64 children, 40 and 24. We administered a battery of standardized tests. The unresponsive children, the children in January who were going to get spring tutoring and the controls were comparable on these measures over here. And together, the 2 groups were below average on our standardized tests, and you can look at that very briefly. Our secondary tutoring was administered in groups of 2 to 4. We used a validated treatment protocol that addressed these reading skills. This is first grade, keep in mind. We ensured fidelity of treatment implementation. That is, we made sure that our tutors were implementing the validated protocol the way the validated protocol should be implemented. So what we found was that our spring tutored children and our control children showed similar growth from the beginning of year to January. Okay, they were both in the regular classroom. And what we hypothesized was that if our secondary prevention program was effective, there would be a divergence from January to the end of the year because one group was getting tutoring and the other group was not. And indeed, the spring tutored group showed greater growth than controls from mid-year to the end of the year. On 3 of 4 measures, on 3 of 4 standardized measures of reading, early reading, good, well-known, well-accepted standardized measures, the spring tutored kids outperformed the control kids. And here you see our word identification test. These are our spring tutored children. This is beginning of year, mid-year, post. So you see these 2 lines are parallel. They're very similar to each other from beginning of the year to January, but in January we get this divergence in favor of the tutored kids, and here is at the end of 2nd grade. So this difference maintains 1 year later. Word attack, we get a somewhat similar result with spring tutored kids outperforming control kids at end of year and at end of first grade and end of 2nd grade. Sight word efficiency was the 1 of 4 tests where we did not find a difference between the 2 groups, but in decoding, again, we find that pattern. We also, I tell you, I'm going to, let me wrap this up because I want to make sure Lynn has time. It's much more important to me that Lynn has time than it is to you because I have to live with Lynn, you don't. In sum, Lynn, wherever you are, we have findings that demonstrate the effectiveness of first grade secondary prevention tutoring in the spring semester for students who were not responsive to our level 1 prevention, our primary prevention in general education. We have evidence that indicate, and so do other people, have evidence that RTI indeed can reduce at-risk children and children who end up with LD at the end of first grade. So there is a strong and increasing evidence base that RTI, when implemented well, now keep in mind, you know, and I know that there are school folks here, we are very much aware that we implemented this in a way that schools might not be able to. We had the intensity of focus, we had the money, we had the resources, and it is a jump to go from our research and our colleagues' research across the country to schools and say, you can do just as we can do. Still, even with some slippage, and I mean no denigration by slippage. I mean, you guys are just playing a different ballgame. But even with some slippage, we are confident that the school's efforts can be strong enough to get results that are similar to the results that we get. But RTI is a complex machine. It is going to be an ambitious effort. We feel it's doable, but it is ambitious, and everyone needs to walk into this with their eyes open. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
Hi. So I'm going to talk about precursors to learning disability and screening efforts, because when Doug talks about having an efficient and effective RTI system operating in schools, one important component to an efficient RTI system is having good screening methods to identify the right children to enter Tier 2 or Level 2 tutoring. Because to the extent that we have large numbers of false positive screens go into tutoring, then we are wasting school resources because these children would do well without it. And if you notice in the data Doug presented, among the 84 students initially screened as at risk in that spring-only tutoring, only 40 proved unresponsive by the end of the first semester of first grade. So we know based on our data, and the data were even worse, more alarming for the control group. So we need effective but efficient ways of entering the right students into Tier 2 tutoring. So that's what I'm essentially going to talk about. We want to avoid false positives entering tutoring unnecessarily because we're squandering school resources when we do that. And we want to avoid false negatives, that is missing children who need to be treated, but the screening tool does not pick them up. So another dimension to our research program on RTI centers on effective screening methods. And as Doug said, the principal investigators are not just Doug and me, but also include Don Compton as, an equally important person in these studies. So one of the things that we're looking at within our screening research is the use of dynamic assessment, and I'm going to talk quickly about a study on the utility of dynamic assessment that attempts to teach beginning of third grade students algebra for predicting third graders' development of mathematical problem-solving skill. And with dynamic assessment, what we do is we help students learn a task, and we index their responsiveness to that instruction as a measure of their learning potential. Why dynamic assessment generally? Well, many screening tools suffer a floor effect. We're trying to predict students' outcomes 6 months later. Many students score 0 or near 0 on screening tools. There are multiple explanations for that poor performance, including inadequate prior opportunity to learn. For low-scoring students, what we want to do with dynamic assessment is distinguish students whose inadequate prior learning opportunity is causing their low scores on the screening tool, as opposed to students who have genuine risk for poor learning outcomes, even with good general education. So if the goal of screening is to forecast students' learning potential, then why not assess students' capacity to learn rather than what they already know? So that's what we're trying to do with dynamic assessment. Within RTI, what we're hoping is that dynamic assessment will reduce false positives so that fewer students enter tutoring who really don't need it. And we also, with DA, dynamic assessment, are hoping that earlier identification of non-responders to secondary prevention, that we can find those students right off the bat with dynamic assessment so we can avoid 10 or 20 weeks of Tier 2 tutoring that will just prolong their academic failure. So we're trying to work on both ends of the screening distribution. This study that I'm going to talk to you about extends prior work in these ways. The dynamic assessment of algebra skills at the beginning of third grade is quite novel because what we're doing is teaching students math content, which is neither a precursor ability nor a foundational skill for solving word problems, which is the predicted outcome. We're predicting that outcome 6 months later. In the study, we controlled for potentially other important measures of cognitive abilities that might be associated with word problem development. We also included treatment as a condition and as a competing predictor variable so that students were randomly assigned to receive validated word problem instruction or not. And also we incorporated word problem outcomes that were near or far transfer from the instruction that they received. So here are the 3 algebra skills that were taught in the dynamic assessment. The first skill, skill A, finding a missing variable in the first or second position within an addition equation. So x plus 5 equals 11 or 6 plus x equals 10. Skill B was finding x in a multiplication equation. And skill C was finding a variable in equations with 2 missing variables when one of those variables is defined. So here's sort of how the DA goes. The student begins on skill A, that's finding the missing variable in an addition equation, and immediately takes a 6-item mastery test. Very few students at third grade show mastery, which is what we want. We want to have a tool that, an assessment that allows us to teach them something and index how well they learn it. So if, in fact, the child masters that skill right off the bat, they receive a score of 6, and they move on to skill B, okay, which is like 3x equals 9. But if they don't master the skill, then we begin with a scripted instruction that is the least explicit form of instruction we can give on that skill. Okay? And then we administer another alternate form of the mastery test. If the student masters it after that fairly implicit kind of instruction, they receive a score of 5, and they move on to skill B. If not, we move on to the next more explicit level of instruction, okay? And so on through a maximum of 5 increasingly explicit levels of instruction. Okay? If the student doesn't master the skill after all 5 levels of scaffolding instruction are administered, then the dynamic assessment is terminated. But if the student does master the skill, regardless of the scaffolding level, then we administer a generalization item for that skill with a value of 1 additional point. And so what that means is that across the 3 DA skills, your best score could be a 21, meaning that you mastered all 3 skills before it was even taught. Okay? And your worst score is 0, meaning that you could not master even the first skill, even with 5 levels of scaffolded instruction. Okay. So why do we pick algebra as the DA task? Well, first of all, we could assume that it was unfamiliar to 3rd graders. Second, it was sufficiently difficult that most 3rd graders would not solve problems without assistance, but they could learn the tasks with varying amounts of assistance. We also assumed that students would have mastered the simple calculation skills that were embedded within the algebra tasks. We also could delineate rules for that underlied the algebra skills so that we could construct clear explanations with a graduated series of prompts or scaffolded instruction. We also could make those levels of scaffolded instruction parallel across the 3 dynamic assessment tasks, and thereby we could promote equal interval scaling within the assessment tool. And also the 3 skills were increasingly difficult, and later skills built on earlier skills, and in that way transfer across the 3 skills would facilitate better DA skills and indicate a better capacity to learn. And finally, although linguistic content is absent from the algebra skills, algebra does require understanding of the relation among quantities, and that's also true for word problems. So we had 122 3rd graders from 30 classrooms. Half of them received validated word problem instruction, and half of them received conventional word problem instruction. We had 6 dimensions that we used as predictors that were competing against each other. One was the dynamic assessment. We had 3 cognitive dimensions. That is, we measured the students' language ability, oral language ability. We measured their nonverbal problem solving, and we measured their attentive behavior. So those were competitors to the dynamic assessment. And we also had prior math skill as competitors. We had calculation skill and we had word problem skill. We also had 2 kinds of outcomes, measures of word problem that were close to the kinds of things that we taught in the intervention, and we had far transfer, that is, word problem skill that was quite removed from what was taught during intervention. And we assessed pre- and post-treatment measurement models using confirmatory factor analysis, which I won't go into, but based on those analyses, we concluded that dynamic assessment measured a distinct dimension of pre-treatment ability. We couldn't take it out of our models and explain for the data, the structure of the data as well. And we also, in terms of post-treatment, needed both near transfer and far transfer also to account well for the structure of those data. But our main analyses were structural modeling to assess the predictors of word problem outcome. In our full base model, we had all 6 dimensions of pretreatment ability, so dynamic assessment, language, nonverbal reasoning, attentive behavior, initial word problem skill, initial calculation skill, all in there, as predictors of near and far transfer. And this big model provided a good fit with the data. But then we contrasted other models, okay, against that big model. And first, we tried to rely, we also had treatment in the model. First, we tried to rely on treatment and just the cognitive variables, okay? That produced a significantly worse fit of the data. Okay? Then we tried to just use treatment and the children's incoming math skills. That also produced a worse fit of the data. And then we tried to use just DA and treatment, eliminating all the cognitive and all the math skills, and that also produced a significantly worse fit of the data. So each of those nested models produced a significantly worse fit of the data. And then we tried to reduce the number of parameters in our model, just to make the model more simple and to fit better. And when we did that, we had 2 significant paths explaining near transfer. Treatment explained near transfer, and children's pre-treatment calculation skill. But when we looked at their far transfer, that is how well they solved word problems that weren't very close to what we taught in the treatment, there were 3 significant predictors, 3 significant paths. One was the dynamic assessment, another was their incoming language ability, and a third was their incoming word problem skill. So what do we conclude? Well, we can go back to that. Dynamic assessment was necessary to forecast academic learning, and it may represent an aspect of learning potential that's different from conventional static measures that we can test kids on at the beginning of the intervention in terms of what their incoming static abilities are. Second, findings suggest that novel academic content, like algebra, may provide a productive avenue for designing dynamic assessments in other academic domains. Third, findings support a possible connection between algebraic content and word problem skill. But what about RTI? Well, the findings suggest that dynamic assessment may serve an important function in predicting students' responsiveness. In that, we can use dynamic assessment, possibly, we hope, to forecast distal aspects of learning that are not highly connected to what we're teaching students. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, we know in reading, for example, there is a group of students who learn decoding and word level skills in the 1st and 2nd grade well enough so they do not emerge as having a learning disability in those early grades. But there is a distinct group of children who emerge in 3rd and 4th grade as having comprehension learning disabilities. So can we use a dynamic assessment to forecast those late emerging learning disabilities, even though the 1st grade program in the general education and even in secondary prevention focuses heavily on word level skill? Okay, so for example, we might have a dynamic assessment that focuses on listening comprehension. Second, in terms of dynamic assessment, if dynamic assessment permits earlier identification of non-responders to secondary prevention, then maybe more intensive and individualized forms of instruction can be, like a 3rd tier, can be introduced more quickly to those students without waiting 10, 20, or in some RTI systems, even 30 weeks for the students to experience additional failure in the prevention system. Why not move them that much faster into the 3rd, more intensive tier of instruction where we can give them individualized instruction because we can forecast that they will not respond to conventional instruction. So it's 10 of 9, and we were told to leave 10 minutes for questions. So that's what we're going to do next. Yeah.
Have you looked at learning disabilities in children with giftedness?
We have not, and that's an interesting question because the RTI system, by refocusing the operationalization of learning disability from IQ achievement discrepancy, it seems will substantially decrease the number of gifted students who get identified as having a learning disability because the focus really is on low achievement.
And is giftedness itself a learning disability because of the IQ discrepancy being 2 means away from the norm?
Many children who are gifted, their achievement is commensurate with their IQ. So I would say the vast majority of gifted children are never classified as having a learning disability in the sense of learning disability as we're talking about it today. Other questions about the framework, about the kind of tier level 2 secondary prevention programs Doug was talking about, or innovative screening like I was talking about?
How long did the dynamic assessment take for the kids to participate?
It takes this dynamic assessment, and we have one in decoding, and we actually also have one in listening comprehension, takes anywhere between 15 minutes if the child, doesn't master the first skill, and as much as 30 minutes for students who go through all 5 levels of scaffolded instruction at each of the 3 skills. So it is an investment of time, and the way we would see a dynamic assessment working is in a multiple gating system so that students take an initial screen. We can set the cut point on that initial screen high enough to make it improbable that we're missing any students who are truly at risk. And then it's the subset of students who fall below that cut point who would take a dynamic assessment so that we would be avoiding entering a lot of false positives into small group tutoring.
And what about using these kinds of things with younger children?
Yeah, there's actually studies. There is at least one really nice study at the beginning of kindergarten, teaching students phonological awareness and using that, their response to the phonological awareness instruction as a predictor of end of kindergarten reading performance. And in that study, dynamic assessment worked very nicely. And there is actually a preschool study too. So, Wendy.
Is there a reason that I'm sure there is, a reason that you don't use precursor skills as predictors to outcomes, or you pick less related skills?
Well, in the model here, we actually, we do have competing cognitive predictors. So, and these 3 dimensions, cognitive dimensions, are the 3 big ideas based on research in terms of what should predict students' word problem skill. Language ability being the main one. Nonverbal reasoning as almost always coming out as a significant predictor, as well as attentive behavior. But the problem on these kinds of skills too is that we are measuring what they come into school with, and it's hard to take out from the picture how much of their problem is due to poor prior learning opportunity. And that's what we're trying to do, in an admittedly limited way with a dynamic assessment.
There's not necessarily a reason that you couldn't teach a precursor skill.
Oh yeah, and people do that in dynamic assessment. So there are dynamics assessment that actually work on, as in phonological awareness, which is considered actually to be, a predictor, a precursor ability that's foundational to reading. So yeah, people definitely do that.
Is tuition also a child had problems
Only to the extent that if their processing ability makes it difficult for them to respond to the dynamic assessment in the same way that it would make it difficult for them to respond both to general education and to even small group tutoring, then I think that it's not something we want to take out of the model. You know what I mean? We don't want to separate and account for it. We want it to be in there. In the same way that, for example, attentive behavior is rated by the classroom teacher. Now, that's an important thing to get to because we're really trying to index their response, at least in part, to general education. Even though, you know, the dynamic assessment is being conducted on a one-to-one basis.
I did have a question. If the dynamic assessment helps identify students who wouldn't otherwise be identified, wouldn't those students look like responders on CBMs during treatment? So then I'm wondering, doesn't that suggest we need to do something a little different to determine who's responding?
Yeah, I think that there are constraints on the kind of measures we can use to index in a progress monitoring framework responsiveness. So we are teaching word level skill, and it is very important for us to have measures, our primary major measures, to be word level skill as our measure of responsiveness. But we know that there are reading comprehension deficits that may be lurking. But we don't have good ways to index those in students who are still acquiring word level skill. So that would be the contribution of a language, a listening comprehension dynamic assessment, even in first grade, if we could use that to help us pick up the kids who may respond well to word level instruction, but are going to emerge later with comprehension problems.
Maybe I could be a little more explicit.
Okay, sorry.
Does this suggest that we should include dynamic assessment in our progress monitoring?
I think it's too expensive to be used that way. And so what we're trying to do is to see if administered prior to intervention, it will accomplish the same goal. So if we can identify, for example, students based on the initial dynamic assessment who are likely to emerge later with comprehension deficits, we can then work on their comprehension-related skills even at first grade to provide early prevention. Does that help to reduce the probability that they will later emerge with those comprehension difficulties? Bob?
Well, first comment is absolutely incredible what you're doing. The second one, I'm still kind of struggling how to explain what's going on in my mind, but it seems to me.
We could stop with just the first one.
It seems to me that the elephant still in the room is the diagnosis of ain't been taught.
Yeah.
And maybe this could help bring forward better knowledge about who those teachers are and what we can do about that. Can you speak to that?
Go ahead.
Let me piggyback on that. And I know that there are school people in the room. There may be state people in the room. Let me put you guys on the spot. I mean, what's your reaction to RTI in general? I mean, not in the abstract, but in terms of its relevance and importance to the Metro Nashville Public Schools. I mean, after all, the schools, rightly or wrongly, are sort of in receivership or under the direction of the state. This is not a great time for the schools, although I hasten to add, Lynn and I both know the Metro schools well enough to know that there are terrific teachers in the Metro schools, and there are some terrific schools, so many terrific schools in the Metro schools, a point that oftentimes gets lost. But it's a tough time, and what does RTI speak to you? Do you see promise? Do you see problems? What?
I definitely see promise here. It gives us the ability to sort of change our thinking, where historically, if a student struggles, the approach has been to locate the problem inside the child. There wasn't even a question beyond that. It's just, is there a problem inside the child? So this gives us a systematic way of evaluating not only what challenges does the learner bring to the environment, but what does the environment bring to the learner. So I'm excited about that, and I think there's high leverage there. Also, I think there's really high leverage in having real-time data to know whether or not instruction is working. So, from my perspective, this is exactly the direction that we need to be headed, and I think it has, tremendous potential to help us improve.
I think getting back to Bob's question too, I think that to the extent that we have high proportions of students in a given classroom who are failing to meet benchmark criteria, screening criteria, who are failing to respond through short-term progress monitoring data, that we can see it there, to the general education program. When there are high numbers of students in a given class, I think that should be a signal for the principal to worry about, I think Doug said this, worry about the quality direction of the general education program, at least for that group of students. We wouldn't want to have an RTI system where the quality of primary prevention is inadequate, such that secondary prevention is getting better, because a school and a system can't work that way.
I may be speaking out of turn here because I have a foot maybe in both camps, but one thing that strikes me, Doug, about this is that there is still a widely held mindset that you're going to have to overcome in order to get something like this truly integrated and operationalized, and that is special ed's over here, general ed's over here. Is there a problem? Get them over here. That's a huge thing to overcome.
Yeah, I'm sure
But
that's true.
if it's never tackled, it'll never happen.
It'd be quick about it. It'd be quick
Yeah,
about it.
it'd be quick. Okay, well, it's a little after 9.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.